the 11 lessons that I had were firstly that transitions are very complex and they take time, that the context and past experiences of a transition really shapes a region's response to an experience of any new transitions or ones in progress. Also, that preparation is really required for transition, and now that can either be government led or regional or local or community group led, but prioritizing a proactive approach to a transition may be one of the best approaches. Also, personnel restructuring processes are very important. So these are ones that might be negotiated by government or brokered by government between companies and trade unions and the local community, leading to an orderly phase out for workers. But however, in doing so, a balance must be struck between in the phase out between community needs and workers and company needs, and also the environmental interests. So never forgetting that obviously a just transition, the most just transition, is a fast-paced transition. Also, social dialogue, I found was an effective, if not really a fundamental mechanism for fostering the types of trust and really kind of good policy making, in that you have a good overview of the overall situation because you all have all the players in the room and all the players are equally valued. So that can be very, very good for adopting a problem solving approach to a transition. Also, new institutional structures for social dialogue. I found that they kind of came up in the case studies a lot as well, characterised by an overarching target, a strong target or goal, such as Germany's Coal Exit Commission or Scotland's Just Transition Commission, which was looking at net zero by 2045. This can create a momentum and maintain discipline with a new kind of body being set up to achieve that target or that phase out of a particular industry. However, flexibility might be required, such as maybe allowing for the inclusion of new groups, or for a shorter time period due to the Paris Agreement, for example, focus on 1.5 degrees. Also, very important was a kind of inclusive place-based approach. So as transitions can be very complex, can take an awful long time, such as the Ruhr in Germany, which took 60 years from the 1960s onwards until complete phase out in December 2018. That kind of inclusive place-based approach and understanding of local issues, local concerns, and how kind of things operate on a kind of grassroots level is very important, with a focus on overall regional development. So not just kind of redundancies for the immediate workers, but looking at kind of supply industries or schools and universities in the area. Also, uncovering, valuing, and cultivating existing skills and capacities in a region. So sometimes with this kind of simplistic idea of jobs versus the environment, you can kind of get a perspective where the skills in a region are kind of outdated, which is never really the case. In the Ruhr in Germany, because of long work in phasing out the coal industry, the coal industry itself led to the development of a really strong technical scientific basis in environmental protection and management because of the history of mining in the region and protection and mitigation of the impacts. So skills audits can be very useful in that manner in transitioning a region, finding out what are the skills of workers that perhaps might not be qualified in a certain way, might not be attached to a university degree. However, they are real skills and real metis and knowing, and should be appreciated in that manner. And a coordinated economic approach for the state could kind of assist in that. So giving people direction and giving people kind of a momentum and inclusive process. And that comes to the last lesson, which was state investment in support of alternative infrastructure could also be very helpful. And one of the very kind of inspirational books that kind of helped us in the National Economic and Social Council at the time when I worked there was Mariana Mazzucato's The Entrepreneurial State, and other kind of similar approaches as well. Well, this was actually one of the most fascinating parts of the project, actually, and consider myself very lucky to have been able to examine these different countries and their experiences. And also the interviewees I had from these different countries were just amazing. But one of the regions that was very interesting, and there's been an awful lot of academic work around it, which was very helpful, was Latrobe Valley in Victoria, Australia. So Australia's kind of context is very interesting. There's some great work by Fergus Green, and also the Gibson Trades and Labour Council and Voice of the Valley there, and the Latrobe Valley Authority too were very helpful in interviews. But the context and history there was that there had been, well, first of all, the people were encouraged to move to the area in the 1920s by kind of a state electricity company, which was set up and built whole towns for the development of the coal industry there. In this context, in Victoria, Australia, the local workers and the workforce had been encouraged to settle there from the 1920s onwards on Indigenous peoples' land. And that kind of process meant that whole towns were being built, whole infrastructure around power plants and so on was kind of a priority for the state in that region. And what happened was that you also had kind of coal mining as well, which led to the destruction of whole towns too. So whole towns were actually physically dug up for coal, and Indigenous people were kind of moved off that land as well. So you had this beginning context of kind of extractivism, and kind of a taking sort of approach to the environment and the local people and the Indigenous people. And then you also had a context of a very proud labour history building up in the region because of kind of the need for fighting for strong workers' rights and very, very dangerous work. You had this kind of very dangerous coal mining activity. Also, coal mining fires as well would often happen. And that kind of history of fighting back against this and a strong labour union protecting the local people, a very kind of almost in some respects kind of a very kind of idyllic kind of community in that it was all built by the state and everyone knew each other very well, very small towns. And that was then kind of all also a very big net contributor to Australia's development. The electricity, the coal, providing electricity to big cities such as Melbourne, became very much kind of a proud part of their history. And then very suddenly, in the space of 10 years, with privatisation and liberalisation of the energy industry in the 90s and 80s, you had a 90% drop in employment in the space of only 10 years. And you had a sudden rise in kind of mental health difficulties in the region, health difficulties, long-term illnesses because of the coal industry, because of lung disease and so on. And overnight, kind of a lot of the literature kind of refers to the fact that they moved from net contributors to a begging bowl. So the state and the region, very, very proud history, overnight almost reduced to kind of something that was totally out of line with how they conceived of themselves. And it was privatisation and liberalisation of the energy industry that was the main problem and the main cause of this. And at the time, they were told that it would result in more jobs, but that was not the case. And you had worse paying conditions then, more health and safety kind of difficulties. The private coal companies didn't have so much of a stake in the region, and the kind of less and less kind of care of the workplace and also of the mines led to a major fire in the Latrobe Valley in 2014 as well, which lasted for 45 days and caused kind of numerous health difficulties in the region as well. And you have to remember, again, as I said, that these mining activities often dug up whole towns. So these towns were very, very close to the mine, a matter of meters in some cases. And that kind of pain and that history and that kind of understanding of what government or private industry could do to a region in a negative manner really frames the context of new climate policies and kind of transition policies. So the Gillard government in 2011, which was hailed as a very good government from a climate action point of view, really fighting back against kind of the mining industry, very, very good government in respects. However, they had a contract for they wanted to implement a emissions trading scheme and a carbon tax. However, that was accompanied by a contract for closure, which had billions in compensation payments for the mining industry, for kind of the corporate companies, which were privatized and liberalized and owned by shareholders, and were not accompanied by strong or, if any, structural adjustment plans for the actual regions that were going to be implemented. So this also really framed the context of climate policy in that it was kind of seen as a bailout or a large kind of payout to these companies that had already caused such harm in terms of low pay and conditions, bad health and safety, mine fires, and also climate change, and also privatization and liberalization. So this kind of then caused a backlash locally against the Gillard government, against climate policies, but it wasn't actually climate policies, if you get me, that people were angry about. It was this kind of lack of structural adjustment or support and a breakdown of trust. And that's very, very important when we are planning just transition policies, that a very simplistic kind of narrative has developed of people caring for their jobs over the environment, when that's simply not the case. If you dig down into the region's history, you'll find that there were community groups all along, or even trade unions, building a just transition approach. Voices of the Valley in particular were planning new regional development, green development, and all of that was undermined by an approach that perhaps favoured larger vested interests, private interests, over what actually the community itself wanted, and then made it very difficult to talk about climate action at a local or regional level. And so that's kind of an important context to keep in mind when working on a just transition. I suppose social dialogue is very, very good for developing kind of a rounded approach to climate policy. It prevents sort of siloed thinking, or kind of, this classic trap, as myself working on climate policy, you can kind of get caught up in a technocratic kind of approach, rather than looking at maybe what's happening on the ground, which is very important for a just transition. And one theorist that I really recommend is Ian Goff in the UK, who has developed this very interesting approach called the double injustice of climate change, coupled with the triple injustice of climate policy. So the double injustice of climate change, as we well know from climate justice, global south perspectives, is that those that have contributed least to climate change, and those are those who will be worst affected by it, such as in kind of low-lying countries in sub-Saharan Africa and so on. However, the triple injustice, and also the poor, sorry, in the Western world too, but the triple injustice of climate policy can be that those who have contributed least to the problem will also bear the brunt of climate policy, because it hasn't kind of taken that more cohesive or social dialogue approach that can allow the different problems or different conflicting priorities to emerge. And that has really come to the fore in the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, which I think was brilliant in terms of allowing conversations that to happen about climate in a manner that went down really into the fine detail and allowed kind of issues such as the fact that, I suppose for so long climate policy has been seen in and of itself as a public good, which it is. Climate action is a public good, of course, necessarily so. But not all climate policies or the choices that we make to target climate action are in and of themselves public good orientated or focused on climate action. Sometimes they can actually make climate action worse because it was an easier decision at the time, such as gas, which is the classic example in Europe. Gas was chosen because it was a lower emitting fuel than coal or oil. And now we were dealing with a situation where gas was encouraged, and now we have to phase that out quickly. And methane actually contributes more or just as much as coal or oil. But in Scotland, the Just Transition Commission has allowed the fact that Scotland is heavily reliant on the North Sea oil and gas. You have places like Aberdeen, which are kind of one of the wealthiest places in the UK outside of London. And you have kind of a lot of wealth in the region coming from oil and gas, while the government is also trying to kind of establish and facilitate and offshore wind industry. And instead of perhaps offshore wind replacing jobs in North Sea oil and gas, you have the two kind of continuing in tandem, and there's no kind of plans or transitionary processes being planned to move people over from one industry into the next. Though there's been huge work by Scottish Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, that the skills in oil and gas are very transferable over to offshore wind. And those kind of difficult conversations were not really given space before, but the social dialogue allowed by the Just Transition Commission helps with that in kind of a broader whole economy approach. And then you have kind of very good examples in Germany with the Coal Exit Commission from 2018 onwards, and also the Ruhr Coal Runde, so the phase out plan for the Ruhr, where there you had very strong talks brokered by government through the Coal Runde, and also the kind of tradition in Rhenish capitalism of kind of worker participation on state boards. And what these kind of processes or institutional structures for social dialogue did was allowed kind of trade unions, workers, less so local authorities, which is something important. Local communities do need to be included more. Allow them to kind of really hash out good plans or transitionary plans for the region. And this is kind of something very important that might be lacking in certain contexts. That sort of idea that the state has to roll up its sleeves and broker a table or open up negotiations and help these negotiations happen between local industry, local government, local communities, and trade unions. So that's something very important I found as well. The narrative is often kind of this idea of kind of this which is Latrobe Latrobe Valley kind of interviews really said this also, that these people are people that are left behind, and therefore they don't have anything to add. They don't have kind of a particular value perspective or skill set, because that skill set is considered out of date. And that is completely not the case at all. And that's something they definitely found in the Ruhr in Germany. So with the phase out in the Ruhr, as I explained in the beginning as well, you had this kind of heavy coal industry in terms of mining and power plants, and what that actually led to was like this huge jump in renewables, highly technical engineering kind of skills. You have the birth of Siemens, the wind industry players across the world now, highly technical, highly strong engineering expertise, but also very, very strong environmental and sustainable development expertise. Because if you think about it, these are communities who have been at the forefront of the worst of the pollution that our types of industries are capable of. These are people who have lived next to it and breathe in those fumes every day, work on those mines every day. They are often the best placed peoples to develop kind of industry in a way that does not make those same mistakes. So you had a really strong environmental law, environmental policy, environmental impact assessments, really strong kind of technical expertise in those areas, and very good mitigation and rehabilitation of landscapes. So Lautz or Lusatia now is becoming the new Lakes District in Germany, Poland. It's really investing in that kind of good places to live, clean places to live. You also have the Emscher Park initiative, which was the most polluted river in Europe. Very, very damaged kind of river, the Emscher River. And that initiative led to the workshop for old industrial regions, led to fantastic kind of plans and locally led, locally developed ideas run in a very innovative, inclusive procedure. That led to kind of new ideas, led to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, led to kind of sustainable development technologies, and so on. So understanding that we also have this issue in Ireland too, where we have peat workers who've worked with peat all their lives. They are often the best placed people for re-wetting the bog, for knowing how to manage and rehabilitate the bog. ensuring that it can store emissions rather than emitting them, which is a very kind of wonderful kind of conception, I think, of where our future lies. Having trust in people, having trust in these regions. They're not regions that you have to overly manage or watch over to ensure that they don't make the same mistakes again. They themselves, which was part of the ethos of the Ayrshire Park Initiative, if you give them that power, if you devolve that authority to them, they will break those vested interests themselves with strong climate targets or environmental targets. I suppose to that last point of state investment in support of alternative infrastructure, this did come up again and again, and I suppose I'm referring to we took as part of the study the NESC study that when it comes to a just transition, often the question arises, well, why can't there be a just transition for all industries? What's so important about climate change policy? What's so important about a coal plant that it deserves kind of a more focused transition or structural adjustment process than perhaps another type of industry, like the solar industry in Germany, for example, during austerity, during the economic crash, didn't get, I suppose, the same amount of support. And I suppose the answer I would have to that is firstly, of course, all industries deserve a just transition. I think that's one of the fundamental aspects of the trade union call for a just transition, which is where the phrase originated from 400 trade unionists going to the Paris conference in 2015. And Sharon Burrow, in particular from the ITUC, calls for a global minimum wage and global social welfare as well, that this is about all work becoming good work and good quality work. Because, of course, we don't know where the transition will take us. We don't know how it'll work. We want to ensure that no one falls through the gaps. And secondly, I suppose the reason why the coal industry or high fossil fuel industries are focused on from a just transition point of view, that these are often areas where people were encouraged to move to and work and even built in state or company built accommodation. So these were regions such as the Ruhr in Germany, which were actually actively discouraged from working in other industries. Other industries were frightened away from the area or discouraged from being in the area. Land wasn't allowed open to them. Universities deliberately weren't built until 1962 to ensure that that you had kind of a captive workforce, or that you had an industry that had a kind of a pool of labour. So for the state to then step back and kind of wash their hands of the problem, 10 or 20 or 30 years later, and to say to these communities, it's not our fault that everything here has happened, really, it is not in line with restorative justice or participatory or participatory governance. It's very much kind of a hands-off approach that we now know in the last 10 years since the economic crash. The market doesn't lift all boats, and you do need that kind of structural support. And I suppose the alternative infrastructure and state investment in it, again, going back to Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, the idea that most kind of industries, the fossil fuel industry, I suppose, would be one of the largest examples of this. But it is often the state that kind of encourages or creates or facilitates the creation of a new industry. The internet is one example, mobile phones, and kind of also in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure in Ireland as well. We had one of the first state-owned electricity companies with the ESB. And also kind of rural electrification was a state-led public good mandate initiative. And those types of kind of approaches did come up again and again in the interviews. So in Scotland in particular, there was a call from the oil and gas industry itself, which again was reiterated in most interviews, was that people locally don't really mind what it is the industry that they will be working in. They just want to know that it is there for the long term, that there will be good paying conditions, that their kind of lives and communities won't be kind of like frittered away. And the oil and gas industry in Scotland and the unions and local communities and local governments reiterated this call for some sort of state investment in offshore wind. And at the moment in Scotland, there's an approach that's more focused, similar to the oil and gas industry, which is facilitating the private sector through planning regulations, through tax incentives, this kind of very sort of hands-off facilitative approach. And what many interviewees were calling for was a state pension fund, something similar to Norway in offshore wind, a state company, a state energy company, state management of offshore, something that had a financial stake or that had a infrastructural stake in what the new industry was going to be, in order to ensure that it was going to be there for the long term, and that there would be kind of a state backing for it. And this is something that we see internationally as well, and in Europe. The fact that if a loan is backed by a state, or if there is financial investment from a state, it really gives kind of that sort of rubber stamp of approval for investors, whether they be private or local investment in the future of the region as well. So that sort of state investment really does need to be kept in mind. And another good example of it was, I thought, which was very kind of powerful in my own mind, was when the Coal Exit Commission finished its deliberations in December 28. When the Coal Exit Commission finished its deliberations and delivered their plan for the phase out of the coal plants that they had to phase out by 2032 or earlier. The mandate then immediately from the German government at the time under Angela Merkel was to immediately go to the Parliament and pass a bill or start the process for the passing of a bill to deliver massive infrastructure funding to the worst affected regions. So that was the immediate step taken after the commitment to phase out coal, was that the German government would support these regions. It was very much this kind of like, we are here we are with you, we are here to show you trust. Now, whether that's kind of played out in practice is something you'd have to speak to your German colleagues more on, but I did think that was kind of a very strong statement. And you see similar in Spain as well, the Spanish government really backing with strong infrastructure financial support. But financial support is not the only type of support that's needed. So billions have been invested in kind of former East Germany in, again, this 90% drop in employment in the region with the privatization and liberalization of the coal industry there. But what was most important was the kind of locally placed state investment in kind of little alternatives. And I think that's something very important to keep in mind. This isn't just financial, it's also kind of about not quite hand-holding at all, but devolving power, allowing local regions to break free from vested interests by giving them a mandate and giving them financial support and giving them strong local powers for task forces and so on.